Hey everybody, this is Mr. Storm. Hey, this week I think I want to talk about multiple objects. We want to get into creating multiple objects very quickly and talking about how, a little bit deeper about how SketchUp treats objects in our environment, because we're going to create some more complex builds later on. And so it's really important for us to understand how all of this works. I'm going to go ahead and create a new SketchUp project. Now, last week we made a house. We made a tiny house right about here. It was one solid object. Matter of fact, we grouped it together. And I tried to explain how grouping works, but I was kind of pressed for time and things weren't exactly working the way they should. So I'm going to explain that a little bit more in this video. But first, I want to talk about how to create multiple objects of the same type very, very quickly. So let's go ahead and I'm going to create a rectangle here, just a small little square. And I'm going to make it into a cube. Okay, so now I have a nice little rectangular cube here. And let's say I want to make multiple copies of this thing. So I'm going to select the cube itself, so the whole thing. Now what I can do is I can go in here and I can say, oh, let's just copy this, and then, yep, hit copy, it's copied, and then I can paste it in here. Hello. I can paste my rectangle. So now I have two. My rectangular cube has a friend, it has a buddy. But the problem with that is that I can't be sure that this is going to be lined up properly with my cube. Like maybe it looks like it's lined up, but it's really not. It's kind of off to the side and it doesn't really look exactly the right way. Like, hey, that looks pretty lined up, but no, you can tell that it's offset just a little bit. And I can't tell that the spacing between them is exactly what I want either. So there's actually an easier way, a better way to do this. We can use the Move tool, this tool that I have selected here, and we can use what's called copy mode. So if I was to take this Move tool and just kind of like grab an axis here or an edge, you can see that I can kind of just stretch out that edge and move that edge, right? Instead, if I want to, let's select the entire object here first. Then go to my Move tool. So now I have the entire object selected. Notice down here it says Control equals cycle copy stamp mode. So if I hit Control and then drag an object out, it'll actually create a copy, right? Now the nice part is I can select from whatever area I want, and it'll stay locked onto that axis. So if I hit Control again, notice that my cursor has a little plus button next to it. That means I'm making a new copy of that object. So that it lines up really nicely. All of my copies lined up nicely. But there's another problem, right? We're not actually able to create exact copies with the proper spacing. Oh, I accidentally didn't delete that face. Let's do that. I can't create copies, multiple copies, very quickly in that mode, right? So there's a better way to do this. Let's select the entire object again. Not my... I don't want to select the reference human here. Okay. Now if I go to Move tool and I hit Control because I want to make a copy, and I click and start dragging out, I can actually type a distance here. So let's say 30 feet and hit enter, and it actually sends it out the exact distance I want. So that way I can make sure the spacing is exactly what I want. Now, let's actually change that to 2 feet. Oh, that's too close. 4 feet? Let's do 6 feet. Okay, so now I have an exact spacing. It's moved out 6 feet. But let's say I want a bunch of copies of this. Well, with that object still selected, I haven't typed out of it. I haven't clicked out of it. What I can do is I can actually hit times and let's say 10. and it will create 10 copies of that object with the exact spacing in between, right? So times whatever. And while I still have this selected, I can say times 4 instead. So if I only want to make 5 copies or 4 copies of the original for 5 total objects, I can do that as well, right? Now, if I click outside of this, I'm going to lose the ability to make my copies like I was. So as long as you're not selecting an individual object or clicking around, you can just make as many different copies as you want. So let's say maybe 4 isn't enough. Let's do times 7 and hit enter. And it'll create those objects with the exact spacing of my original 2. So that's a really good way to do it. But let's say we actually want to, instead of just creating them out as long as we go, let's say I have a set distance away and I want to evenly space them in between that distance. So let's go to my move tool and we will hit control. And then I'm going to start moving this out and I'm going to say, let's say 30 feet, like we said before. Now in between here, let's say I want 2 more evenly spaced columns. Well, down here in my distance area, I can hit divide by 2, enter. Now it's going to put 1 in there exactly. Now 2 sounded good to me, right? I wanted 2 columns, so I'm going to divide by 2. Well, it's divided by 2, the space between it. So actually, if I want 2 columns, I need to divide by 3, hit enter. Now I have 4 evenly spaced columns from one point to another. So that's a really quick way that you can use the move tool in copy mode to create a bunch of different objects. Okay, now let's talk about this whole idea of making groups, and let's talk about a new idea that we haven't explored yet called components. I'm going to let's create a circle. All right, let's make a nice little column here, push-pull tool to bring it up, and oh, that is not where I wanted it to be. All right, well, let's move it up on this axis here. Oh, I forgot to select the move tool. Let's move it up onto, sure, now it's, all right. So, yep. So you can see how it can be very difficult to move stuff around on with the move tool. So I'm going to try that again and make sure I'm on the blue axis this time. Create a column. It is on the blue axis. Good, 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 good. SketchUp can really kind of trip you up if you're not really paying attention to what you're doing. All right. So in the last video, we talked about moving or creating groups. And I try to explain, but I didn't really do a great job at explaining. So I'm going to show you why grouping is a good idea. I'm going to create a copy of this. I'm going to kind of push it out. These 2 independent objects, they work perfectly fine by themselves. But if I were to mush them together like this and then kind of click out of it, you can see how the geometry is kind of blended in together. And if I were to grab my move tool here and let's say just grab this right here, now they're kind of smushed in, right? They're linked together. Their geometries are now linked. And we get these weird deforming things that just kind of doesn't work, right? Maybe this isn't exactly what I want. Maybe I want them to be 2 independent objects, but they can be mushed together and not deform each other. Well, what we can do is we can create something called a component. Now, anytime you create copies of an object like this in an array, that's good. But notice that if I were to make a change to, let's say, this one here by using my push-pull tool and make that bigger, all the others didn't change, right? So let's say I want an object that will change. All the instances or copies of that object will change. That's why we would use a component. Plus, it creates an individual object that won't be morphed and deformed whenever we kind of push them together on accident. So here's how we do that. Let's go back to creating a circle. I'll create a nice cylinder here. Oh, I still have that area selected. Let's go back here and let's make a nice cylinder. So what I can do is I can select the object here. Oh, not those objects. Let's select just this object. And let's make this a component. Okay. I'm going to right click and say make a component. And I'm going to call this, let's call this cylinder. How do we spell cylinder? I don't know. Let's say tube. All right. So I'm going to make this a component. Or yeah, I'm going to make it a component. Now I can use my move tool to create another instance of this component. And then if I use my push-pull tool, let's grab that, for this face here, notice how it's selected both this face and that face. It's because they're linked objects. So I'm going to use my push-pull tool. Now if I make it bigger or smaller, it actually grows and shrinks that component or every instance of that component together, which is a very helpful tool. So let's say you make a bunch of columns for a building and you realize they're just a bit too small. Well, if they're all a component, then you can actually increase that size very easily without having to worry about going in and doing it for every individual object in that component set. Let's create another one here. And I'm going to use my move tool and let's turn on copy mode, create another one out here. That was weird. Something just happened. It created another copy for some reason. All right, well, whatever. We'll just ignore that for now. I don't want that. Okay. Let's say I want this one to be independent of the other two. Well, what I can do, instead of making it a group or whatever, I can go into, hold on a second. Oh, see, it's selecting both of these. All right, let's not do that. Let's do it for this individual object. I just want an individual. Ah, I see what happened. It made two separate components. This isn't a component of the first one. That's what happened. All right. I have to select, I have to move out the there we go. So now these are two separate component sets. If I select these, I can actually right click and make these a component, tubes, and click OK. Now they're all one component set. And I can actually see over here, my definition for the components is tubes. And if I come in here, I still have my original tube component. So you can make components within components. But let's say I wanted, let's say this one, right? I wanted these two to be separate, right? So what I can do is I can come in here and say, where is my make unique option? Well, I'm not seeing it. That may be something that we can only do in SketchUp Pro. Okay, I'm going to ignore that part for now just because I'm used to using SketchUp Pro, and there's an option where you can make them unique. I don't think that's an option I have available to me. Either that or I've screwed up how you make all these components. But just know that components will allow you to modify certain things, modify specific entities within a group, and you can modify the same attribute for all of the entities in that group. Okay, cool. So components versus groups. Components are better than groups because you can modify those entities and it will keep that modification on all of the copies within that component. Okay. All right, we're going to be using components a lot in this in the next couple of projects, probably. But as long as you understand that a component is different from a group in that you can modify, and that change is applied. That's really the thing you need to know. Okay, let's talk about curves for a little bit. Now, this is going to get into kind of a discussion of how Unity handles curving objects and handles its geometry. So let's talk about how curves work. Notice that the curve itself isn't exactly a smooth curve, right? There are all of these line segments that are angled slightly differently to make it look like it's curving, but it's really not. So if I were to select this face here, I can see that it is one unified face, but it's a bunch of separate line segments. Now, here's a way to make that look a lot easier, or make it easier to see. If I go over to, where's my entity info? Is it right up there? Well, where are my line segments? So I can see that I have 22 or 25 entities here. If I actually come down here and type, let's say, 120. Oh, nope, that's not going to work. Where did it go? Is this another thing I can't change? Okay, well, we can... Huh, that's interesting. I thought I had this option. Apparently not. Okay. Okay. Here we go. It's in the display section. That's where it is. Okay. So let's say I want to turn off or turn on hidden geometry. That would let me see how this curve is segmented, right? I have all these different segments that I can see here. And if I were to look in the entity info, I have 12 faces on this curve. So let's get rid of that and that and that and that and that, and we'll just go down to display. Okay, so now I see I have hidden geometry. SketchUp will create a certain amount of faces on a curve that make it look decently smooth, but it won't take up too much processing power. So you want to kind of understand that these are all separate faces that are pretending to be one smooth face, but they're really not one smooth face. So what I can do actually is I can come in here to this specific face and I can change, I don't know, some attribute about it. Let's put a material on it. So let's say I want to apply this brown material to this one face. Now notice that it's only that one section, right? Or let's say I want to apply this brown material to this half of the curve, and this other half I want to apply a different material. What I can do is I can select the center line here, and then I can, let's see, right click. I can say divide. No, that's dividing the segment. I can unsoften. That's what I was looking for. So unsoften will actually create two separate faces here that I can apply materials to. So I can apply that. Oh, my hidden geometry is still on. Let's go ahead and turn that off. So now I can see I have two separate faces. I can apply that brown material to one side and red to the other. So now I've effectively split my arc in two separate sections. And I can do that with as many separate sections of that arc as I want. so that I can create different faces. So that's one way you can play around with. Let's say you want a basketball, you want to make a basketball or something like that, and you want different sections on your basketball. You can create a sphere, and then you could do that from there. So it's just important to know that there are different ways you can modify a shape, and specifically the faces in that shape. And knowing that this curve here isn't going to be exactly smooth. Let's take a look at a super smooth curve. I'm going to grab a circle tool here, and then I'm going to click, and notice down there it has radius. Let's say I want 3. It's going to create a circle with a radius of 3 inches. And it has all these different segments in it here, right? Let's see how many segments we get. We have to select the object. So, there we go. And if we go to entity info, we have 25 entities within this shape. But if I were to create a circle, and instead of 3, let's make it 10 inches. Oh, I hit period on accident. 10, enter. And then we were to select that object, we still have 25 entities, right? It's using the same amount of objects to create, or the same amount of entities to create this object, even though it's bigger, but it looks less smooth, right? So the bigger your objects are, the less smooth they're going to look. And again, we can go in here and change. We can, let's say, smooth edges, which is going to try to smooth out this object a bit, or soften the coplanar. But the best thing to do is just to kind of leave it alone, even if your object looks a bit weird on up close. It's going to look nice from out or from far away. So let's push pull. So it looks really jagged up close, this 10-inch diameter circle, right? But if we zoom out, you can see it looks like a perfectly smooth column there, right? Okay, perfect. That's pretty much all I really wanted to talk about. There are a lot of options we can play around with. This material stuff we're going to play around with a lot in the next video. I want you to practice creating arrays of objects. I want you to practice with grouping and making components out of objects. I want you to practice splitting up arcs into different segments so that you can apply different features to each. Here's one thing that we didn't really do. When you split this arc, because it's 2 different faces, you can actually use, I still have that selected. We can grab that face, use the push-pull tool. It's smooth. It's a smooth surface. So let's grab that. And where is model info? Where's my smoothing? Oh, well, whatever. I was going to show you something interesting, but I can't seem to find the option here. It's not going to let me smooth. So again, there are some things in SketchUp Pro that you can't do in SketchUp Free, which, whatever. Okay, cool. Yeah, so really the important thing is I want you to play around with arrays, making arrays of objects. I want you to play around with components. I want you to play around with splitting up arcs based on their hidden geometry. So yeah, those are important concepts to understand so that next week when we get into, what are we doing? Materials. When we get into materials, you understand a little bit more about how materials play with faces and stuff. Okay, cool. All right, I'm going to let you guys go. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next week.